Okay, well, Michael, welcome to the Sales Transformation Podcast. And I think, as you know, this particular podcast is actually going back to some of the roots of the doctorate research that I did all those years ago. And we're in the process of conducting 100 interviews with people from all over the world and in different kind of roles within typically the corporate environment about their perceptions of salespeople. And it's kind of appropriate that you are one of the early people that we're interviewing in this project and also have a background in procurement. So thank you very much for kind of joining. I think before we sort of get into some specific questions, do you mind just, describing a little bit the kind of role or roles that you've had up until your current role? And then we can sort of dive into some specific questions a bit later on. Yeah.
So I guess I'm what you'd call a career procurement professional. It followed a fairly classic route of starting off as a graduate, actually way back with limited regional transport, as a supply management trainee. And then I went through the ladder of being an assistant buyer. Those names tend not to exist anymore. They changed perhaps to category lead or procurement lead. And then I got into procurement management. And lastly in my career, I was a procurement head or head of procurement and vendor management. And probably more predominantly in the last 20 years in the financial services and professional services sector.
Okay, that's brilliant. So I wonder if you can give us an insight into the life of someone in procurement. I mean, what are some of the key challenges that someone in your role has?
That's a very broad question. I mean, it probably won't surprise you to know that most procurement people primarily are concerned about the cost base of external spend.
Yeah.
Now, there are certainly other considerations. Risk, third-party risk is very important. You're looking for suppliers who can provide innovation, new ideas, ESG, sustainability, again, increasingly important to an organisation and third-party base. But back to where I started, probably cost is the primary thing that you're focused on. And what we tend to refer to in procurement is spend under influence by procurement. And what that means is when you step back at the end of the year and you look at your total third-party expenditure, and typically it'll be an 80-20 rule, procurement wants to be able to say as high as percentage as possible has had procurement influence. Because to us, procurement influence means that we can give it a virtual tick of it's value for money, it is the right supplier for us at the right price with the right contract. That effectively is what we mean when we talk about procurement have its influence on that spend.
Right.
So we're always seeking to drive up the percentage of spend under
influence. Yeah, okay, that's great. And could you give me an idea of what sort of procurement, I don't know if this is the right word, sort of budgets you'd be responsible for under that?
Well, no, that's an interesting question, because typically we are not the budget holders. In fact, this is relatively rare. It will be I refer quite a lot to business stakeholders, IT, marketing, HR, operations, and so on. Typically, they are the budget holders.
Okay.
Procurement is working alongside them.
Right.
Now, straight away, that gives rise to a number of different potential issues. Yeah. One is that it means our interests are not always entirely aligned, because the relevant business stakeholder, they want to come in within their budget. They're not necessarily interested in beating the budget or going below, whereas procurement just wants to get the best price. The other way in which it has an impact is that almost all procurement departments have a savings target. But very often that savings target is not shared with the relevant business stakeholder. So straight away, you've got a potential tension where procurement are seeking to drive down prices, drive out cost, whereas their business stakeholder is primarily concerned with making sure that they get the most of their for their budget and are not necessarily looking for a cost reduction because they haven't been given a similar objective to reduce spend. Thus, I'm being very general here, but certainly in my experience, it's comparatively unusual to have the procurement segment's target also shared with the business.
Okay. What's the reason why it wouldn't be shared?
That's a very good question. I think historically that's the way it's typically worked. I think also what tends to happen, all organisations will have a budgeting and planning round, typically led by finance. Although procurement is a relatively mature function, in a lot of organisations it's not sufficiently mature that they are fully involved in that budgeting process to give their insight. Again, I'm generalising here. There are certain sectors, particularly if you're buying commodities or perhaps components, where procurement are more likely to be influential and have a key part to play in giving their view of the marketplace. But in financial services and professional services, I'm sure other sectors as well, you've got procurement over here with a separate conversation going on with the finance director about what their savings target might be. Now, on the other side of the organisation, you've got the finance and planning round, which is almost happening separately. And I have to say, I've had more than one conversation with the finance director down the years where he or she has been bemoaning about a certain aspect of expenditure. They've noticed, why are we spending so much on this or that? And I have to politely point out that it's your department that gave them that money. If you feel strongly about it, run a tighter and a more rigid budget round where people are focused on savings rather perhaps giving them what they had last year. I'm going to get off my soapbox a little bit, but I have seen that happen so often.
Yeah, God, it's interesting. So, as a department, how have you found it perceived inside the organisations that you kind of work for? Is it like, are you seen as a driver of innovation? Are you seen as a blocker? I mean, how would you? Because you talk about the tension sort of earlier on, and I just wonder what the sort of branding is, or what your perceptions of the branding of procurement.
Whenever I've started a new role, which I have to say, most of my most recent roles was a relatively greenfield site. Either there's no procurement at all, or it existed but operating at a fairly low level. So whenever I started those roles, I do what all good leaders do. I went around meeting stakeholder departments, and I'd always start the session by saying, so when you hear the word procurement, what words come to mind? And sometimes people are very polite, negotiation, cost saving, but it doesn't take long to get into blockers, bureaucracy, because most people have had experience of procurement at some stage in the past, and sadly that is something, the reputation that we have. It won't surprise you that all procurement people aspire to be business partners. In the same way, if I can use this analogy, if you're recruiting somebody, in most cases you wouldn't dream of doing that without involving HR and the talent acquisition or recruitment department, who will advise you on the marketplace and the best ways to find the right talent and so on. Similarly, procurement want to position ourselves so that when someone is looking for either a replacement solution or a new solution, a new service, they wouldn't dream of doing it without involving procurement. But of course, you have to build up that credibility. You have to show that you can be that you're focused on their outcomes and what they want, but equally you're not afraid to challenge them, so that you want to be in an ideal position. When you say to a stakeholder, I don't think that's the right supplier for you, or I really don't think we've got the best deal out of them yet, they trust you, and they will allow you to go on and do whatever activity you want to do, rather than just think, well, there you go, they're just blocking them again. But you have to earn that trust, you have to earn that right. And it's a fact that a lot of procurement departments aren't there. And when you look on LinkedIn at all the various people writing about procurement and so on, I'd say about 3/4 of those posts are bemoaning the lack of perceived value, the lack of trust in us, perennial complaint, we're brought in too late when a supplier has as good as been chosen, and we just have to go and beat up the supplier, get a better price, but you've got one arm tied behind your back. So there is a lot of that almost chip on the shoulder to some extent. But those that do it right, and when you can turn around someone who has had perhaps a bad experience in the past, or think of us as being blockers, but come to realise that you can genuinely add value and help them to either to reduce that budget or get more from their budget or get better suppliers, whatever it is driving them, then of course that's very satisfying.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to come on to your sort of perceptions of salespeople a bit late, quite shortly. But before we go into that, you talked about 80% of all, expenditure sort of being touched in some way by procurement. And I would imagine that quite a number of the companies you work for actually have huge number of suppliers, from paperclip suppliers to maybe stuff of much higher ticket value. How do you decide where to prioritize your time and what areas are you going to make the biggest impact on? Because even though paperclips may be a commoditized item, it may be, a significant amount of money going on paperclips. So it may not be complicated, but it could be a large expense. I mean, maybe not the best example. But
when I referred to the 80%, I guess what I was getting at there was the fact that typically 20% of suppliers will account for perhaps 80%.
Okay.
So typically when you come as a procurement leader, you've got two lenses. You want to look at the total budget.
Yeah.
So and actually, having worked predominantly as, say, financial services and professional services sectors, the shape of those budgets are not massively different. There will be a large proportion of technology spend, a proportion of HR spend, be it benefits, recruitment, training, facilities spend, a large part of professional services, taxation advice, audits, and so on. So you're going to look at that, and then you're also going to want supplier spend. And it's interesting how often when you go into an organisation, sometimes you're the first person ever to have asked the question, can I actually see all of our suppliers from top to bottom? Because people don't tend to look at that, apart from procurement people. So then you look at that. And so from those two data sets, you start to build up a picture. Here's where I want to devote my attention. There's a lot of talk within the procurement world about what we call tail spend. And it's that perhaps the last 10% of expenditure, all very low value, which probably you could spend hours and hours, days and days on that spend for precious little gains. And actually there are specialist organisations who will look after that.
Right.
Purport to look after that for you. What you're more likely to be doing is looking for those big area spends. To your point also, there could be a spend which is relatively low, but is actually critical to the organisation. So you're going to be looking at that side as well. And it's through that that you decide where to put your attention. AI, of course, is as big in procurement as in any other function. And one of the early uses is spend data analysis, and there's some very good tools out there that will suck in all your spend data and break it down into categories of spend, tier 1, tier 2. One of the things that all procurement people need to decide is the extent to which you want to have as few suppliers as possible. So maybe having one supplier, a simple example would be a facilities management company that does everything from the hard services to the soft services, maybe your catering and your vending, or to what extent do you want to go for a specialist in each of those areas? And there's no right or wrong answer. Those are the kind of judgments you make.
Yeah. Okay, so there'll be some sort of process of analysis by supplier spend. Like you said, it sounds as though that's not something often companies look at until you ask for the data. And then some sort of analysis of the 80% of the spend from 20% of the suppliers, by domain area, whether it's facilities management or IT. And that will help you sort out where, at least start you on a journey of where to kind of spend your time. Okay, that's great. I mean, it's quite, it's quite interesting what you say about procurement in terms of its sort of perception inside a company. Yet, from the sales perspective, what I've noticed over my years of working on the other side of the coin, so to speak, is that procurement has in many ways become much more sophisticated, I think, than perhaps sales has been over the years. And particularly, I've seen this through the lens of sort of major sort of outsourcing contracts where there's a really well-defined procurement process. And you often, feel or sense that procurement people are turning up better prepared than the salespeople are, perhaps in some of these procurement conversations that take place. So it's very interesting. And so what I'd like to move on to now, which I think is really the crux of, the kind of research. So given all the sort of challenges that you've faced in your kind of procurement role, is to talk a little bit about salespeople who've kind of sold to you in a way that has been good, and also perhaps salespeople that have sold to you in a way that you think is not so good. And I wonder, as we go into this conversation, whether you could picture an example. So not going to ask you to name names or anything like that, but if there was a situation that's happened in your procurement kind of career where the interaction that you've had with a particular company stroke salesperson has been really great. And I wonder whether you could describe that scenario, and then I will ask you some questions about it to see where the conversation goes.
All right. So I have a particular scenario in mind.
Okay.
I won't be specific, but let's just say it's a sort of a high cost, highly complex SaaS solution.
Okay.
In the financial services sector.
So could you describe that a bit more? I mean, when you say high cost, so obviously it's strategically a really important
it's
kind of
important. It's
SaaS, multi-million pound.
It impacts the customer directly.
Okay. And the customer would be consumers or brokers?
Yes.
Or yes.
People holding accounts.
Okay.
With the company.
Right. Okay. So SaaS, right?
Yeah. And I think when I think about your question, I probably have to think of it in three phases of the interaction, because you've got the very initial contact,
right,
from the salesperson.
Okay.
Which, not surprisingly, is something that procurement get all the time.
Right.
It's a sad fact of life that procurement people, like most other people, hate cold calls.
Right. Okay.
Which actually really annoys me. Not cold call, but the fact that people in procurement don't like it, because we want to be gatekeepers. We want to be responsible for the supplier base. That I can guarantee, if you get 10 procurement people together in a room, within 5 minutes they'll start promoting the fact they get
too many calls. Yeah.
But there are ways of handling those calls. So in this example,
yeah,
and in a really good professional example, you get some where it's one of two things. Either it's fairly unrealistic. They don't seem to appreciate that you will certainly have a supplier in place for that particular service, and they seem to think you're just going to suddenly switch.
Yeah.
Or it could be they've already had a bit of an engagement with the business, which was the case in this particular scenario, and they can come across as rather presumptuous. So the conversation goes along the lines of, been having the discussion with the IT going really well, understand I need to speak to you.
Okay.
So, that's not going to endear me. I'm already on the back foot because I'm thinking, where's the competition? Because that's what we think. I'm thinking I'm late to the party. I'm thinking, what promises you've been making to them that I've got to somehow unwind? In this case, although there have been previous conversations, it was very much very respectful. Been speaking to IT,
Yeah.
conversation's going well, but absolutely understand there's a procurement process to be followed. Understand that you have a key part to play in that. So, wanted to introduce myself to understand more about your process. Is there anything you would like from me at this stage? So straight away,
Yeah.
yes, it's not quite a cold call, but I'm thinking, okay, he's been respectful. He's always been humble. He almost buttoned me up, but hey, it worked. It was a good interaction.
Yeah.
Then you got the next interaction, which was, okay, we're now into pretty serious pre-sales engagement. We're talking about pricing. We're talking about contracts.
Yeah.
Now, what do I look for at that stage, or what did this particular person exemplify? This is where the whole thing, trust, comes into play. Basic things like the things that were in the pictures or the sales conversations or the presentations in the early days, are you willing to put them in contract?
Right.
Quite a few examples where a claim will be made when you try and contractualize it. They back away, so that they don't want to put it in right. Well, yeah, we'll do it, but it's not going to be part of the contract. That for me is a lack of trust. But that didn't happen in this particular situation. You also want to perceive that the person you're dealing with clearly has the gravitas and the credibility and the weight to truly orchestrate all the different parts within their own organisation. Right. Because in the same way as I'm dealing with my business stakeholder, legal, maybe finance, they will be orchestrating their side, typically legal.
Yeah.
Maybe the operations or the technical people. And you can very quickly see if the salesman you're dealing with, salesperson, is truly doing that and is driving it, or whether they're almost on the fringes and someone else is leading it internally. It's not necessarily a problem, but if we go back to your core question of making it a positive interaction and having a positive feeling about the salesperson, the fact that you can see that they are clearly orchestrating it gives you a lot of faith.
Right.
And even on contract negotiations, you'll come across some salespeople who will very happy to say, oh, I know nothing about contracts. I leave that to my legal people. And straight away they lose a bit of respect, because every procurement person, they might not be a lawyer, but they are trained in contract law and will know the basics of how to negotiate, even if you have a legal person next to you. But this particular example, even though they had a legal person next to them, this person knew their contracts inside out. They knew the commercial ramifications of each individual clause, and they were leading that whole discussion, which I have a lot of respect for. And then finally, you've got the third stage, which is post-sales.
Yeah.
Now, typically, procurement never see the salesperson again. And there's an argument that says, well, why would they? The deal's been done. It's unlikely that procurement are managing that supplier is done because the budget's being held by someone else. Another department is responsible for that service day to day. But it does surprise me that salespeople don't stay in touch. I think for 2 or 3 reasons. One is, quite simply, procurement people move around. They'll be in another organisation sooner or later.
Yeah.
So stay in touch.
Yeah.
You want to know, in some cases, when the next RSP is going to be. You want to position yourselves for that, even looking ahead. And then the final reason is, when something goes wrong with the contract, procurement are very typically the first person that IT or HR will speak to say, got a problem with this, can you help me?
Yeah.
So if the salesperson has stayed in touch with procurement, it's just, first of all, you've continued the rapport, makes any issues easier to deal with. You can perhaps even give them a heads up if you're really on the ball, and that's actually happened in this case, to say, just let you know, not sure if you've heard, had a bit of an issue, an outage, whatever it was last week, but just let you know, we've managed it and it's all okay. So when the procurement, when it was approached a few days later by the operational department, I was already aware of it. Okay. So you've got there the 3 different stages and examples of how that particular individual really led me to have a great respect for them.
And would you, if you found someone like that who sort of impressed you, and in all points of engagement in that sort of the different phases, I suppose, of the sales or buying cycle. Would you look to using that person again if you could, or it's not within your, if there was another technology related kind of need, would you, or do you know what to what extent?
Presumably you're talking about they're with the same company,
Yeah.
but they perhaps got another service that
Perhaps,
or they move on to another company.
Or perhaps if you've moved on to another company, let's say. I mean, I don't know whether that's ever happened. If you're used to dealing with a particular person, would you bring them into a conversation if you could see a link between what they did and the need of the new company that you were in?
Yes, I mean, we all like to deal with people that we already know and trust and like.
Right.
But there's probably only so far that's going to get.
I get
if I moved to a new organisation and I knew that they were looking to possibly procure
something similar,
that would get the introduction. But clearly I could not.
Yeah.
Their service or their solution would need to stand absolutely on its own merit.
Yeah. But it's okay. I'll come back to the question perhaps a little bit later on. So that's a great example. It's really interesting how you've chunked it down into the three stages of the sales cycle. Could you give me an example of someone that was terrible? Is there a standout example that you?
Yes. Okay, obviously, I'm not going to name names.
Yes.
There actually was. It was a payroll solution.
Okay.
Procuring a certain organisation.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that the salesperson was not friendly and outgoing. I mean, that's such a low bar.
Yeah.
In fact, I say my entire career, I can only think of 2 examples where the salesperson was actually fairly obnoxious.
Okay.
And we were all agreed we just don't want to deal with this person.
Yeah.
That's very, very rare.
Yeah.
All procurement people, salespeople, and procurement people are nice, friendly people. But the shortcomings was that it was clear that they didn't carry an awful lot of weight and credibility internally.
Yeah.
The sales manager kept having to step in at various stages of the interaction. But it's a fine line because that's not necessarily an issue. Indeed, if you're only, especially when we're negotiating hard, we like to hear that this has gone well above my paying grade, has gone up to the CEO to sign off.
Yeah.
So in itself, that's not necessarily a problem. But when you start to get the impression that the salesperson is they're just the front person to you contact first, but they're clearly other people are pulling the strings and making things happen.
Right.
You will get to the deal, but you do start to worry, particularly post the deal. Is this person got the clout to truly represent my organisation as I wanted it to be represented?
Right.
In their own organisation. Because if you're working for a very, very large company for whom your revenue with a supplier is massive, frankly, it doesn't matter if you are horrible people to deal with, you pay your bills late, you're still going to be looked after very well.
Yeah.
But if you are mid-tier, you've got to fight much harder to be a customer of choice. Yeah. Customer of choice, by the way, is something that procurement people talk about a lot. If your revenue isn't that high, how do you become customer of choice so that you get the new innovations, where there's an implementation or some kind of consultancy project, you get the A team and not the B team. Yeah. And there's been a lot being written and spoken about the kind of things that you need to do. But one of the things that you need is to have an account manager, a salesperson who's really fighting your corner. Yeah. And if you've got the impression during the whole sales process that the person you're dealing with probably can't do that, then then it's not going to work for you. But what typically happens then is that you would ask for the salesperson to be changed. I can't ever think of an example where has a stakeholder who really liked a particular company's solution or service, but the salesperson was so weak that we turned away, because salespeople can be changed. I have plenty of examples where we've had a quiet word with someone more senior who said, "We need a different salesperson here," because that's easy to change them the solution.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I imagine you must be dealing with all sorts of different procurement, conversations with vendors in a year. I imagine there's quite a few different conversations going on. And going back to what you were saying earlier about, what the exceptional salesperson does in terms of, the knowledge, kind of qualities you spoke of, respect, you use the word humble, knowledgeable, not just about, not someone just about to, do a quick sell, but to be there post sales as well. That was quite interesting. Of all the people that would knock on your door, and you would not necessarily knock on your door, but you would engage with, what kind of percentage would you put on those salespeople that have sold to you in a way that's made you think this has been a fantastic experience?
It's of those that have been successful in winning business from us, you're probably looking at maybe 20 to 30%.
Okay.
But there will be a higher percentage who were as good,
Right.
were doing all the right things. It's just that unfortunately for them, either the timing wasn't right, or the solution or service that they were selling just wasn't quite right for us, and we went with someone else. It is almost easier to think of those, and it's a fairly small percentage where they were sold for,
Yeah.
or perhaps were not tenacious enough, didn't follow up enough, or did not spread their net wide enough, and who were talking, who weren't successful.
Yeah.
Because I do think in today's age, as most sectors, solution services have matured, and in the social media age as well, frankly, if you have a poor customer service, poor performance, poor solution, you're probably not going to be in business.
Yeah.
That's a sweeping statement.
Right.
But I guess what I'm saying is, most of the people who would approach the kind of organisations I were working for were not chancers. They were working for good organisations with a very good solution. So that's why the percentage of salespeople who were displaying behaviours I was describing earlier as being very positive is actually high.
Right.
Doesn't automatically lead to success, because there are so many other factors. But it's not often you come across someone who is bad.
Right. Okay. I think you'd be very, very nice there.
Now, could you follow up by saying that's my perception? Internally, I gave an example of perhaps not being tenacious enough in some cases. So I'm sure that some of the people who I thought were doing a decent job, it's just that I knew they had no chance of ever selling to me because of the situation. Internally, they may well not have been following the playbook that they had been given, but were not speaking to the CFO when they should have been. They were not speaking to the right people. They were not uncovering the right pain points. All of the things I've been learning now about the sales process. So it's not necessarily to say they were doing the right thing, but it could be that.
So by the time they got to you, those that got to you, there's been some sort of sorting on the way. Is that what you're saying?
Sometimes.
Because of the qualification process and
some people will, they're sizing up an organisation, and they usually LinkedIn or whatever they use, and their first port of call is procurement.
Yeah.
That happens quite a lot. And in those cases, it could be a service that I'm quite knowledgeable about. I know who we're using at the moment, I know the ins and outs of the service, and I could sit down and have a conversation with them about their relative its strengths and weaknesses to decide whether to put them in front of the relevant stakeholder.
Yeah.
But in an increasingly sophisticated, complex world, there'll be lots of solutions that someone is selling that, frankly, I'm not the right person to speak to. So the only role I can play is to possibly tell them whether we already have a solution in place or not, and then point them to the right person. Yeah. And after that, it's kind of down to them to pierce.
If you're looking at the qualities that if you can sort of you give me examples, but it's a chance for you to describe the qualities that you particularly look for in someone that that will earn your respect or whatever. What words would you use to describe the qualities?
Empathetic. Salespeople love to talk. I know it's a cliche, but those that truly listen. In other words, just stay quiet for 10 minutes and let me speak about my organisation, my objectives, the organisation's objectives, our pain points, and so on. That for me all comes under empathy. Credible. You just feel that they talk good sense, they clearly carry weight within their organisation. I'm going to say trustworthy, but of course, it's difficult. You have to often take someone, at least initially, at their word. And often you only find out that someone is not as trustworthy as you think, when sadly something perhaps might go wrong. Yeah. But nevertheless, having given that caveat, I think you do build up an impression, can I trust this person? Two examples of where that becomes important. One is when there are issues or problems along the way. Yeah. Somebody who is open and transparent about them, doesn't try to cover it up. Ideally, it comes to you before you're even aware of it. That's wonderful. And then also trustworthy and open on how they are remunerated. Because most procurement people are aware that salespeople are typically remunerated to grow the revenue and grow the business within a particular client. Whereas our job is to reduce that cost. So we're always diametrically opposed. And I'm always impressed, assuming it's true, when an account manager or salesperson sells me, I am purely measured on your customer satisfaction. That's great. If I found out that actually they're also hugely bonused to increase the spend, I would lose a little bit of respect and trust. Probably naivety on my part. But that'd be an example of where perhaps I was thinking they're really on my side, I can trust them. Yeah. And then you find out. It doesn't often happen that you find out. And as I think most procurement people are not under any illusion that a salesperson is seeking to increase the revenue. Right. So I've given three examples there.
Yeah. Okay. Positive attributes. And I suppose the negative attributes then.
Well, I suppose it's the reverse. Somebody who only ever talks and doesn't listen. I mean, if they're talking good sense about the marketplace and their company, well, that's not a bad thing. But, if they don't shut up and listen, how do they know it's directly relevant to me? So being unempathetic in terms of not listening properly, shying away from issues or problems, never proactively talking about them, would be a no-no. They're probably the obvious things I would think about.
That's great. Okay. Is there a question that I haven't yet asked you that I should be asking you to get down to the essence of what makes a great salesperson?
I suppose a good question would be in the digital age when so much information
I was going to ask you about yes. the digital impact.
And it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently.
Yeah.
I was really struck at your GTST event where a couple of people in the audience said that they'd had experience of pretty high value, high complex procurements being made with no interaction. Yeah, salesperson. And I really found that fascinating. I've thought about that a lot. I suppose where I'm on that is two things. One is, yes, there is so much information out there. Now, if you're looking to buy something, there's lots and lots of information.
Yeah.
But almost so much that you often need to speak to someone to help you to make sense of it and to guide you through it.
Yeah.
Second thing is, it's words that you can read. Surely you want to question, probe, put someone's feet to the fire and find out if the fine promises they're making hold true. And then the third reason why I would think you would want to talk to someone is, if something was to go wrong, I would not want to be the person standing in front of the CEO and said, well, no, I never even actually spoke to him. You know, just follow the information I get. It would not be a comfortable place. And I was saying earlier how a lot of sectors are quite mature now. So there's a lot of very high quality organisations out there, all of whom have a great product, a solution, service, whatever it might be. So how do you differentiate? Well, price could be one. But the other way tends to be cultural fit, which is a bit of a nebulous term. It can always mean whatever you want it to mean. Yeah. But I suppose at its heart is, it's people we can do business with. We like them, we trust them that they're going to resolve things if things don't go well, and so on. Now, if we come back to where we started on the question, does this new digital age mean that it changes everything we've been talking about with the interaction with suppliers? I actually don't think it does. I think 10, 20 years ago, when there was less information available digitally, you needed to speak to salespeople to find out about their solutions and products. Yeah. So you had to. That was your main reason for wanting to do it. In today's age, you still want to speak to them and still require that trust, but for slightly different reasons. Not because you don't have enough information, it's almost you've got too much. And my personal belief is, and certainly from what I see with my own stakeholders when I've been working in mid-sized organisations, is you absolutely want to get to know them, to be able to question them about their solutions and all the promises they've been making. And also, it goes back to what I said earlier about customer of choice, if I'm not going to be your largest client, I want to know you, I want you to know us, to make sure that we're absolutely the right fit for you and that you're going to be fighting my corner. All of which means I think you ought to have as much interaction with salespeople as ever. I know there's been lots written, lots of surveys that show that buyers want less interaction with salespeople. And I'm sure that is true. They will do a lot more desktop research, and they'll be a lot more informed about whatever sectors they're buying in. But in my personal experience, having done all of that, they still want to eyeball people for the reasons I give them.
I mean, some of the challenges on the other side, that salespeople face when dealing with procurement is, you can get involved in quite a rigid procurement kind of process. And, salespeople are looking for ways to maybe get access to people that could influence the decision beyond procurement. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about that? About vendors going outside the process in order to try and create a competitive advantage?
So it's not going outside the process is clearly something I'd be very much against, and it's a classic line in RFP, isn't it? You must not speak to anybody else. Yeah. The procurement, otherwise you might be debarred. So people should go outside the process. However, a bona fide, properly run process should involve full interaction and access to the relevant people. Okay. And if it doesn't, that would raise alarm bells. And actually, in the sessions I now run, in the role I have, training salespeople, I get a lot of questions about should we respond to RFPs where we've had no interaction. In a recent meeting, that they kept using the phrase blind RFP, which is the same thing. And yes, I mean, because in those scenarios, there's either two things in play. One is that nobody's had a chance to speak to the right stakeholders, in which case I really would wonder how procurement are running it, I'd have to say, because it's unlikely they are an expert in whatever it is they're buying. There could be, but it's quite unusual. And they're unlikely to be managing it thereafter.
Yeah.
So the idea that you can just run a process, make a decision, and hand over the supplier to a reluctant stakeholder, I find very, very strange. So it could be that no one's had access, which raises alarm bells.
Right.
Or the other scenario is you're aware that other people have had that access, perhaps prior to the RFP. Now suddenly you're on the RFP list, but you're not being given access. Now that would strongly suggest you're making up the numbers. Because classic RFP orthodoxy has it between 3 to 6. And there could be 2 or 3 really key, you might have an incumbent there, or 3 or 4 have been spoken to, or need another 1 or 2 to make up the numbers. Well, okay, it'll be them. Now, if your intelligence picks up that that's the case, if you're having to make a decision whether to bid or not, especially if you've got scarce resources, don't. Because you really are on hiding to nothing. I did run a session where the sales director was very open. He said, in that situation, he said, I would ignore the instructions and I would go and speak to the right people. And I have been asked, well, would you actually debar somebody? If you're in a public sector, almost certainly you would have to. In the private sector, you'd have a little bit more freedom. And what typically happens, it would be, by the way, this has very rarely happened, but it'd be a practical decision to make. If the organisation in question is generally making up the numbers, they probably will be debarred. And the procurement people and the relevant department thinking, great, one less proposal I need to read through. But if there's someone who you really think has got the right solution, are you kind of your nose to spite your face by saying, well, no, you're debarred, and probably get away with it. I wouldn't suggest it or condone it, but you probably will get away with it. But, I mean, it's a long-winded way of saying I cannot imagine ever having run an RFP without the full involvement of my stakeholders. And actually, procurement looks much more powerful, I think, when they're standing side by side with the business stakeholder.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think that probably confirms my experience as well of you could have a very genuine challenge to a procurement spec for a solution, which you generally don't believe is the right thing. And even though the company may have gone through many hours of putting, the spec together that they think they need. And I think we had it at GST, didn't we, with one of the panelists saying they genuinely didn't think that what they were being asked to pitch for was the right solution. And I think what was interesting in that scenario was because it was not just a tactic, it was something that they absolutely felt wasn't the right thing, that they were prepared to be disbarred from the procurement process. And in actual fact, I think they re-engaged months later when there was a better fit. So it certainly didn't do their credibility any harm, even though they didn't win that particular deal. So it's quite interesting. Where do you draw the line? I think we've often said we talk about the industrial era, the knowledge era, the post-knowledge era on some of our programs. In the industrial era, the sellers had so much control of the sales conversation because there was no information out there. Sellers had the data, they knew their products, services, they could manipulate conversation to try and make their features seem like benefits and all those sales techniques you've probably experienced in your career. And then, of course, for the internet, like you said earlier, there's so much knowledge now that the buyers often have more knowledge than the seller. So arguably, the sort of control has been taken away. The sellers get involved later in the procurement process. And I just wondered whether in the new era that we're now in, whether with the pace of change happening so quickly, whether that sort of the confrontational type relationships that existed prior has in any way changed. So it's more of a sort of problem solving, sort of collaboration, or do you think that there's still that sort of buyer seller?
I think it's a system of buyer seller. Now,
Okay.
I am coming in from a procurement angle.
Right.
We are a cynical bunch.
Okay.
So
So you start off. So the poor salespeople starting off with the basis of, we don't 100% trust you.
Well, I suppose because there's any procurement person as a negotiator will tell you the first price is never the best. You have to fight and fight to get the best price and the best contract and so on. So I completely agree that in the internet age, it means that typically a business stakeholder is coming to either a formal RFP process or decision with more knowledge. But I still think, having done that, first of all, procurement people will always be encouraging formal competition. It's one thing for my stakeholders to go on the internet and look at lots of information. That might help to whittle it down to the 2, 3, 4 best options. But you still want to have some form of competition. Yeah. Even within procurement circles, people are saying, as the RFP had its day. Well, there are different flavours of RFPs, but at its heart, it's all about competition. It's a blunt instrument, but it's a powerful instrument. Any salesperson will tell you that they'll have one sales list price and discount where there's no competition, and another one where there is formal competition. So I think that will still exist. So yes, I'm not convinced. I think if we move to an era where there isn't that, I'm going to use it too negatively to say that there's disconnect between buyers and sellers, but there'll be a lot more happy salespeople, however competitive the marketplace is, if they're not having to deal with procurement people who are trying to ensure there's proper competition and a true, proper, hard negotiation. Yeah. Because with the best one of the world, again, a bit of a stereotypical statement, the average business stakeholder is not particularly good at or does not enjoy negotiating. And most of them will freely put their hand up and say they don't enjoy that part. Whereas procurement people, of course, love it. And even when I have dealt with business stakeholders say, I've really been up on price, what you tend to find is they've been very good on the headline price, but then you look at underneath the hood at all the other ancillary pricing or the price escalators or other parts of the contract, and you realise they've not really been focused on what you can, which of course a good procurement professional would do.
Right. And a good sales professional would understand that as well.
Absolutely. Oh, yes. Give away as much as you can on the big headline prize, and then make it up on the maintenance, the consultancy, the 5% escalator every year, whatever it is that makes sure that the shape of the deal over 5 years is very attractive. Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think it's been a fantastic chance to explore the whole issues of selling and buying. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been brilliant. Thank you. Me too.